Resident Evil didn't invent survival horror. It inherited it from a 1989 Japanese film tie-in game that almost nobody in the West has ever heard of. And the story of how that happened involves The Exorcist, a Famicom cartridge, and ghost enemies that got swapped out for zombies at the last minute. Let's start at the very beginning, the Sweet Home origins. In 1989, a Japanese horror film called Sweet Home hit theaters. It was directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who'd later become one of the most respected names in psychological horror cinema. The special makeup effects were handled by Dick Smith, the legendary artist behind The Possessed, Regan's Look, and The Exorcist. So already this isn't some throwaway project. This had serious talent behind it. But here's the thing. Capcom simultaneously developed a video game adaptation for the Famicom, and that game quietly became the blueprint for an entire genre, Sweet Home. The game followed a documentary crew exploring an abandoned mansion called the Mamiya Mansion. Players had to navigate a sprawling, hostile environment filled with supernatural enemies, and they had to do it with painfully limited inventory space. Every item slot mattered. Every healing resource was a decision. If your characters died, they were gone for good, and the game featured multiple endings based on who survived. Sound familiar? It should. The game was directed by Tokuro Fujiwara, a Capcom veteran who'd previously worked on Ghosts and Goblins. Fujiwara found something interesting while wrestling with the Famicom's hardware limitations. The console couldn't render anything terrifying through raw graphical power, so the team built tension through atmosphere, or resource scarcity, and environmental design. The constraints made the horror work better, not worse. Years later, Fujiwara conceived and produced the original Resident Evil for the PlayStation. The initial concept was heavily inspired by Sweet Home. That's not an exaggeration. The mansion setting, the limited inventory forcing constant resource decisions, the door-loading screens, the narrative that keeps moving even when things go horribly wrong for your characters. All of it traced back to that 1989 Famicom cartridge. Even the enemies started out differently. Early Resident Evil concepts explored supernatural threats, more in line with Sweet Home's spectral horror. The team eventually switched to zombies created through viral infection, and that single change gave Resident Evil its scientific horror identity, separating it permanently from its supernatural origins. So, when Resident Evil launched in 1996 and the gaming world declared survival horror a brand new genre, it wasn't new at all. It was 7 years old, trapped on an obscure Japanese cartridge that never got an official Western release. The genre's true birthplace is virtually unknown to the people who love it most, which is, not ideal. But if you think a scrapped origin story is wild, wait until you hear about the protagonist Capcom completely erased from Resident Evil 2, the Elza Walker prototype. Claire Redfield is one of the most beloved characters in Resident Evil history. She's also somebody's second draft. Before Claire ever touched a motorcycle or set foot in Raccoon City, there was a completely different woman standing in her place. Her name was Elza Walker, and she's the ghost buried in Claire's DNA. Here's the thing. Resident Evil 2 originally looked nothing like the game you know. The prototype build, commonly referred to as Resident Evil 1.5, was in active development from mid-1996 before Capcom scrapped the entire thing around early 1997. And during that window, the main female protagonist wasn't a Redfield. She wasn't connected to Chris. She wasn't connected to STARS or the police or the military or any of the franchise's usual institutional anchors. She was a motorcycle racer enrolled at Raccoon University who just wanted to start the semester. Elza Walker was a young woman who loved bikes and had a racing background, which is, a pretty specific identity for a character who technically doesn't exist anymore. Her visual design leaned entirely into that. Racing jacket, protective gear, the kind of outfit that said motorsport, not survival horror. She looked like she belonged on a track, not in a zombie apocalypse. It was a completely different energy from anything the franchise had done before, or has really done since. But here's where it gets interesting. When Capcom killed the 1.5 build, they didn't just delete Elza and start from zero, they took her apart and rebuilt her. The core concept, a young, resourceful, college-aged woman with a connection to motorcycle culture, survived the total overhaul intact. They changed her name, her face, her backstory, her family connections, literally everything on the surface, and yet the thematic DNA carried over almost perfectly into Claire Redfield. Think about that for a second. Claire rides a motorcycle into Raccoon City in the opening of Resident Evil 2. She's young, she's not military, she's not a cop, she's just a college student looking for her brother. Every single one of those traits traces directly back to Elza Walker's original character concept: the motorcycle enthusiasm, the youth, the civilian resourcefulness. It all survived a complete character demolition and reconstruction. It's a fascinating look at how game development actually works. You can tear a character down to nothing, change their name, redesign their appearance, rewrite their entire history, and the archetype still bleeds through. Elza Walker never made it into a finished game, but every time Claire Redfield kicks a motorcycle into gear, she's riding with a ghost. And speaking of things that were designed to mess with your head, let's talk about the architect whose buildings were literally built to trap you inside them: George Trevor's architecture. Every time you play the original Resident Evil and find yourself pushing a statue onto a pressure plate, pulling a bookshelf to reveal a hidden corridor, or dodging a trap that fires poison darts from the walls, you're not just engaging with game design, you're experiencing one man's entire professional philosophy brought to life, and that man is George Trevor. Here's the thing. George Trevor was a renowned New York architect, and his whole deal was designing buildings that function like elaborate mechanical puzzles. Secret rooms, hidden passages, anti-intruder trap systems, the works. The guy basically looked at a normal building and said, what if this was also a nightmare to navigate? Which is, not ideal for the people living inside. In 1967, Umbrella founder Oswell E. Spencer contracted Trevor to build a private mansion deep in the Arklay Mountains, far from civilization, and more importantly, far from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Trevor completed the Spencer Mansion in November 1969, and on paper it served as a private residence and gathering place for Spencer and his associates. In reality, the entire structure was designed to conceal the underground Arklay laboratory, where Umbrella conducted bioweapon research that would eventually destroy Raccoon City and kick off basically every catastrophe in the franchise. But here's where it gets interesting. Trevor didn't know what the mansion would be used for. He was just doing what he always did, building intricate, puzzle-laden structures filled with concealed passages and mechanical locks, every crank mechanism, every emblem-shaped keyhole, every wall that slides open when you place a gemstone in a tiger statue's eye socket. That's not Capcom being quirky with level design. That's George Trevor's documented architectural style rendered as interactive gameplay. The man accidentally designed survival horror into existence within the fiction itself, and the tragedy doesn't stop at architecture. Trevor's own family got pulled into Umbrella's orbit. His daughter Lisa became one of Umbrella's most disturbing test subjects, subjected to experimental virus injections that transformed her into something barely recognizable as human. George Trevor himself was trapped inside the very mansion he built, left to wander his own labyrinthine creation until he died. He designed the building that enabled the concealment of the research that destroyed his daughter. He built the walls that hid the labs. He engineered the security systems that kept outsiders from discovering what was happening underneath. So the next time you're wandering through Spencer Mansion, solving some absurd puzzle involving a music box and a gold emblem just to open a door, remember that there's a fictional architect who specifically designed it that way. And that same architect's family paid the price for his craftsmanship. Every locked door in that mansion is both a game mechanic and a small piece of one man's legacy, a legacy that enabled horrors he never intended. Great! Add that to the list of things in Resident Evil that are way sadder than they need to be. But if the main games have layers this deep, buried in their lore, wait until you hear about the Resident Evil stories that were never even released as games. The radio drama exclusives. Most people think they know the full Resident Evil story. They've played the games, watched the cutscenes, maybe even sat through the movies. But here's the thing. Capcom quietly produced an entire layer of narrative content that the vast majority of Western fans have never heard of, never seen referenced, and definitely never listened to. We're talking full audio dramas. Professionally produced, voice acted, broadcast on Japanese radio, and then pressed onto CDs with actual catalog numbers. This isn't fan fiction. This is official Capcom canon that expanded the Resident Evil universe in ways no game ever did. Let me explain. Capcom had a subsidiary label called Sulputer that handled music and audio production. Through Sulputer, they created multiple sound dramas that told stories set within the Biohazard universe, featuring established characters in completely original scenarios. These weren't promotional clips or bonus features buried on a disc. They were standalone narrative productions distributed through radio broadcasts and retail CD releases. The Biohazard 2 drama album, titled The Female Spy Ada Lives, was released as a CD drama expanding extending Ada Wong's narrative beyond anything Resident Evil 2 covered, it received a physical release under catalog number CPCA-1025. You could walk into a store and buy it. Most Western fans don't even know it exists. But the one that genuinely unsettled me during research was the earlier production, Biohazard. The Tragedy of Makoba Village aired on Radio Osaka from June 2nd to June 23rd, 1997, and followed Jill Valentine exploring a remote, mysteriously dilapidated village. And when I say mysterious, I mean the drama goes out of its way to make you feel like something is fundamentally wrong with this place. Jill arrives in Makoba, and she immediately notes that the village isn't just abandoned. It's anachronistic. The buildings, the infrastructure, everything feels temporally displaced, like she stepped into a settlement that belongs to a completely different era. Nothing about it matches the surrounding geography or timeline. Then she meets children. One of them is named Toby. And the drama just lets that unease sit there, building atmosphere through sound design and voice performance in a way that games of that era couldn't replicate. No pre-rendered backgrounds, no fixed camera angles, just voices, sound effects, and your imagination filling in the gaps, which is, not ideal when the gaps are this creepy. The broader implication here is genuinely significant. These dramas contained character development, world building, and narrative threads that were never replicated or referenced in any game release, meaning that for decades, a complete understanding of Resident Evil canon has technically required engaging with Japanese exclusive multimedia content that was never translated, never localized, and never acknowledged in Western gaming discourse. The regional media barriers created two entirely different levels of franchise knowledge, depending on what country you lived in. So the next time someone claims to know everything about Resident Evil, you can ask them about Makoba Village and watch the confusion set in. But if hidden audio dramas change how we think about the franchise's story, the next entry changes how we think about its most iconic face, literally. Jill Valentine's real-world face models. Here's something that will genuinely mess with your head. If you've played Resident Evil across multiple generations, you've been looking at Jill Valentine's face for potentially hundreds of hours, and you were looking at two completely different human beings without ever realizing it. Let me explain. When Capcom released the 2002 Resident Evil remake, they needed a real person to base Jill's updated face on. They chose Julia Voth, a Canadian actress and model born May 16, 1985. Voth's facial structure became the definitive Jill Valentine for an entire era of the franchise. Her likeness carried through the Umbrella Chronicles, Resident Evil 5, and essentially every appearance Jill made during that console generation. If you picture Jill Valentine in your head right now, there's a solid chance you're picturing Julia Voth's face rendered in polygons. You just didn't know her name. Then 2020 rolled around and Capcom decided to remake Resident Evil 3, and they quietly swapped the entire human being behind Jill's face. Sasha Zotova, a Russian model, replaced Voth as Jill's face model for the remake, and when the redesign surfaced, the reaction was split. Some fans embraced the new look, others launched petitions to bring Voth back, which is the internet's way of saying we noticed, and we have feelings about it, but the game shipped, people played it, and over time most players accepted the new Jill. They saw Jill Valentine, not a different person's bone structure mapped onto a digital skeleton. But here's where it gets even more layered. Even within a single game, Jill Valentine wasn't just one person. The 2002 remake featured live action footage in its opening cinematic, using a separate actress to portray Jill in those sequences. So in that one game alone, you had Julia Voth's face, a different performer's live action appearance, and a separate voice actress all combining to create one character. Jill Valentine is basically three people in a trench coat pretending to be a single STARS operative. This is how long-running game franchises actually work, and nobody thinks about it. The character you're emotionally attached to is a Frankenstein assembly of different humans stitched together across different production departments. Face model provides the geometry. Voice actor provides the personality. Motion capture performer provides the physicality. And when the franchise jumps to a new generation, they can swap any of those components without most players ever noticing. Your favorite character is, on a fundamental level, synthetic. Constructed from parts, a committee of real people wearing the same digital mask. The wild part is that this happens constantly across the industry. But Jill Valentine is one of the clearest examples, because the visual shift between Voth and Zotova is genuinely noticeable if you put the models side by side. Different jawline, different eye spacing, different nose structure, two completely separate human faces that your brain filed under the same name for over a decade. And somehow, it worked. The character survived the transplant because Jill Valentine was never really about one specific face. She was about the beret, the attitude, and the ability to survive things that would kill literally anyone else. The actual human underneath was always interchangeable, which is, not unsettling at all. But if the construction of a single character from multiple real people seems complex, wait until you hear about how Resident Evil's most fundamental design choice, the camera perspective you play through, was never supposed to exist in the first place. The first-person perspective. Roots. Here's something that will completely reframe how you think about Resident Evil 7. When it launched in 2017, everyone called it a radical reinvention, a bold new direction. Turns out, no. It was the franchise finally circling back to where it started over 2 decades earlier. The original 1996 Resident Evil was conceived as a fully 3-dimensional first-person game. That was the vision. Walk through a haunted mansion seeing everything through your own eyes. But the PlayStation hardware took one look at that concept and basically said, yeah, that's not happening. The console could not render convincing first-person 3D environments at the quality Capcom wanted, so they pivoted to third-person fixed camera angles with pre-rendered backgrounds, essentially creating beautiful static paintings that the player character walked through. And here's where it gets interesting. That technical limitation accidentally produced the most iconic visual identity in survival horror history. Fixed camera angles meant every shot could be composed like a scene from a film. A zombie could be lurking just off screen, and you'd have zero idea until the camera cut to the next angle, and there it was, 3 feet from your face. You literally cannot do that with a real-time camera following the player around. The constraint created something better than the original vision ever could have, but Capcom never fully let go of the first-person dream. They kept poking at it like a scab they couldn't leave alone. In 2000, they released Resident Evil Survivor, a light gun shooter that finally put players into first person. It launched in Japan with GunCon compatibility, letting you physically aim a plastic gun at zombies. Except when it came to North America, they removed the GunCon support entirely. So the game designed around pointing a physical gun at the screen, shipped as a first-person shooter you played with a controller. Here's our exciting light gun game. No, you can't use a light gun. Have fun. The experiments continued in smaller, weirder ways. Resident Evil, Deadly Silence on the Nintendo DS featured a rebirth mode with first-person knife combat sequences using the touchscreen. Zombies lunged at you and you slashed them with the stylus. It was a gimmick, not a revolution, but it proved the itch was still there. Then 2017 happened. Resident Evil 7 launched, and the entire gaming world treated it like the franchise had reinvented itself from scratch. First-person horror, isolated setting, a return to genuine terror. Critics praised its bold new direction, but here's the thing, it wasn't new at all. The team behind the original 1996 game wanted to make a first-person horror experience from day one. They just couldn't. The technology didn't exist yet. Resident Evil 7 wasn't a reinvention. It was the realization of a creative vision that had been waiting 21 years for technology to catch up. The franchise's most celebrated modern transformation was actually a return to its earliest abandoned concept. 2 decades of hardware evolution just to get back to square one. Sometimes the long way around is just the scenic route to where you were already headed. But if you think a 2-decade development loop sounds chaotic, wait until you hear about the version of Resident Evil 4 that featured a ghost with a hook for a hand-haunting Leon Kennedy through a gothic castle, the Hookman version. Before Resident Evil 4 became the game that redefined third-person shooters forever, it almost became something completely different, something way more terrifying, and we got to see it, briefly, before it vanished. At E3 2003, Capcom showed the world a build of Resident Evil 4 that looked nothing like what eventually shipped. Leon Kennedy was wandering through a gothic mansion, and the enemies weren't parasites or cultists. They were living dolls, spectral figures crawling out of painted portraits, and the star of the show was a ghostly entity wielding a massive hook, phasing through walls and stalking the player like something out of a nightmare. Fans immediately called it the Hookman version, and it became one of the most legendary pieces of lost gaming history overnight. Here's the thing, this wasn't just a random prototype thrown together for a demo. Director Shinji Mikami and his team had identified a structural problem that had plagued survival horror since the genre existed. By the midpoint of any Resident Evil game, you've got a shotgun, a grenade launcher, enough herbs to open a pharmacy, and a pretty solid understanding of every enemy type. The fear just evaporates. You go from terrified survivor to walking armory in about 3 hours. The solution was hallucinations. Make the player question what's actually real. If you can't trust what you're seeing, it doesn't matter how many rockets you're carrying, you're still scared. The internal name for this build was literally hallucination, which tells you everything about the design intent. Leon would experience increasingly disturbing visions that blurred the line between genuine threats and psychological torment, meaning the player could never fully relax regardless of their inventory. And a primary inspiration? The 1990 film Jacob's Ladder, starring Tim Robbins as a Vietnam veteran who can't tell if the horrifying things happening to him are real or delusions. Now here's the kicker. Jacob's Ladder also directly inspired Silent Hill. One single 1990 movie shaped the creative DNA of both Resident Evil 4's most ambitious prototype and the entire Silent Hill franchise. That movie basically helped invent psychological horror gaming from a director's chair without anyone involved ever touching a controller, but Mikami ultimately scrapped the build. The GameCube hardware couldn't properly handle the real-time lighting and transparency effects the hallucination concept demanded. The tech just wasn't there, and Resident Evil 4 moved on to yet another redesign. The Hookman footage became a ghost itself, haunting fan forums and YouTube compilations as a glimpse into an alternate timeline where Resident Evil went full psychological horror instead of action horror. The ideas didn't completely die, though. Haunting Ground, a Capcom survival horror game released in 2005, featured a young woman being stalked through a castle by relentless pursuers in an atmosphere dripping with psychological dread. Elements of the scrapped builds are widely believed to have found their way into that game, and the castle setting concept that originated in the earliest RE4 prototypes that persisted through every single build, including the Hookman version, all the way into the shipped game. Some ideas are just too good to kill completely, even when you scrap everything around them. What makes the Hookman version so fascinating isn't just the creepy E3 footage, it's that the team correctly diagnosed a fundamental flaw in survival horror design and proposed a solution genuinely ahead of its time. Games like Amnesia, PT, and even later Resident Evil entries would eventually explore the idea that psychological uncertainty is scarier than any monster. Mikami's team was trying to get there in 2003. They just didn't get to finish the job, but if you think a scrapped prototype is a wild origin story, wait until you hear about the Resident Evil build that got rejected so hard, it became an entirely different franchise. The Devil May Cry connection. Devil May Cry is not a game that was inspired by Resident Evil. It's not a spiritual successor. It's not even a cousin. Devil May Cry literally is a Resident Evil game, wearing a trench coat and pretending it doesn't know you. Here's what happened. In 1999, Capcom started working on Resident Evil 4 for the PlayStation 2. The first prototype was directed by Hideki Kamiya, who would later go on to create Bayonetta and become one of the most respected action game designers alive. Kamiya had a vision for Resident Evil 4 that was, to put it gently, not very Resident Evil. His prototype featured a dynamic camera that followed the action in real time instead of the series' trademark fixed angles. The protagonist had superhuman combat abilities. The gameplay was fast, stylish, and aggressively action-oriented. It looked incredible. It also looked absolutely nothing like survival horror. Shinji Mikami, the creator of the original Resident Evil and the guy essentially standing guard over the franchise's soul, played the prototype and made a call. This had drifted too far. It wasn't a Resident Evil game anymore, and no amount of tweaking was going to pull it back. The survival horror DNA was gone. The resource scarcity, the vulnerability, the tension of not knowing if you had enough ammo to survive the next room, as all of it had been replaced with combat mastery and power fantasy. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of scrapping all that work and starting over from zero, Capcom made a genuinely brilliant organizational decision. They told Kamiya to keep going, just not as Resident Evil. Kamiya took his core design, his combat systems, his dynamic camera work, and started swapping parts. Government operative protagonist? Now he's Dante, a half-demon hunter with white hair and a leather coat. Zombies and bioweapons? Now they're supernatural demons. The setting shifted from anything resembling the real world into full demonic realms and gothic architecture. The tone went from, please God let me find more shotgun shells, to I'm going to juggle this demon in the air with twin pistols while making fun of it. Devil May Cry released in 2001. It sold over 2 million copies. It didn't just succeed, it basically invented the character action genre as we know it. The franchise has since produced 5 mainline entries and an animated Netflix series that debuted in April 2025. An entire legacy, spanning decades, born because one guy's vision for Resident Evil 4 was too cool for Resident Evil. The philosophical split between the two franchises is genuinely fascinating when you think about it. Resident Evil is built on the idea that you are fragile. You are a normal person with limited bullets, limited health, and limited options. Every encounter could be your last, because the game wants you to feel like prey. Devil May Cry is the exact opposite. You are invincible. You are the most dangerous thing in any room you walk into, and the entire game is designed around making you feel like it. Vulnerability versus invulnerability. Scarcity versus excess. Two completely opposing design philosophies that emerged from the same project at the same studio during the same development cycle. And despite being Capcom siblings who literally share genetic material, Resident Evil and Devil May Cry have never had a proper story crossover. Dante and characters from both franchises have shared a screen in Marvel vs. Capcom fighting games, but that's about it. No shared universe event, no narrative acknowledgement. Two franchises born from the same creative moment, and they've never meaningfully crossed paths, which is, a little awkward at family reunions. Oh, and one more thing. After Kamiya's prototype was spun off into Devil May Cry, Resident Evil 4 didn't just move on to a clean second attempt. It went through multiple additional failed prototypes before Capcom finally landed on the version that shipped in 2005. The development of Resident Evil 4 was less of a process and more of a hostage situation that accidentally produced two legendary franchises along the way. But if you think accidental design decisions are wild, wait until you hear about the very intentional choices behind Resident Evil Village's most famous character, Lady Dimitrescu's height design. When Resident Evil Village dropped in 2021, the internet did what the internet does best. It became collectively obsessed with a tall woman. But before Capcom said a single word about Lady Dimitrescu's actual dimensions, fan communities had already done the math. And I mean, serious math. Players were cross-referencing Ethan Winters' proportions against doorframe heights, measuring architectural features in Castle Dimitrescu down to the pixel, and running comparative analysis like they were submitting a doctoral thesis on fictional vampire anatomy. The consensus, roughly 8 feet tall, which is enormous. That's approaching Robert Wadlow territory, the tallest documented human being in history, at 8 feet 11 inches. So fans figured they'd cracked it. Case closed. Lady Dimitrescu is freakishly tall, but technically within the realm of biological possibility. Then Capcom art director Tomonori Takano stepped in and said, basically, that's cute, but no. The official height, 2.9 meters, 9 feet 6 inches. She's taller than any human being who has ever lived. The announcement came with the energy of someone who fully understood the absurdity of issuing an official press statement about how tall a fictional vampire lady is, which is, not ideal for the people who spent weeks doing geometry homework for fun. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Takano didn't stumble into those proportions. From the very first piece of concept art, Lady Dimitrescu was towering. Her height wasn't a visual gimmick, it was the foundation of her entire character identity baked into the design from day one, and the inspirations are way more layered than most people realize. Her elegant, statuesque presence was influenced by classic portrayals of feminine power and old horror archetypes. That commanding theatrical energy you feel when she's on screen, deliberate vintage Hollywood influence filtered through a distinctly Japanese horror lens, but the supernatural framework came from somewhere much darker. Takano drew from Hachishaku-sama, a Japanese urban legend about an impossibly tall female specter. The name literally translates to 8 feet tall. In the legend, she appears as a towering woman in a white dress and repeats a single sound, po po po, over and over. She targets children and young people. Once she's chosen you, there's basically zero escape. So classic vampire aristocracy fused with a Japanese ghost story. That combination apparently breaks the internet, because Lady Dimitrescu didn't just become popular within the Resident Evil community. She transcended it entirely. Memes, fan art, cosplay. There's discourse that spilled out of gaming spaces and into mainstream culture within days of her reveal. She became arguably the most culturally discussed element of Resident Evil Village, despite occupying a relatively modest chunk of the actual narrative. She's not even the final boss. She's not even close to the final boss. And that's the real takeaway. A single character design, built on wildly different inspirations, and given a height that exceeded even the internet's most generous calculations, captured more cultural attention than the entire rest of the game combined. Capcom designed a villain for a horror game. The internet turned her into a cultural event. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.